July 1st, 1928, Sunrise Cafe, Brooklyn. The telephone rang 3 times before Frankie Yale picked up. Whatever was said on that call convinced Yale to leave immediately. He grabbed his keys and bolted for the door. His dark Lincoln sedan sat outside, polished to a mirror shine, chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Yale turned the key. The engine roared to life. A black Nash sedan idled half a block behind him. Yale pulled onto 44th Street, heading toward his home in Borough Park. The Nash followed. Through residential streets lined with brownstones and corner groceries, past women hanging laundry and children playing stickball. The 2 cars moved in silent procession. Yale checked his rearview mirror once, then twice. He pressed the accelerator. The Nash accelerated too. At the intersection of 44th Street and 14th Avenue, the Nash pulled alongside. Yale turned his head. In that fraction of a second, he would have seen the barrels extending through the passenger windows. The first burst shattered the Lincoln's windows. Glass exploded inward as bullets tore through the door panels. Yale's body jerked violently as rounds ripped into his chest, neck, and skull. His foot slammed the accelerator to the floor. The Lincoln lurched forward, engine screaming, veering wildly across the street. The Nash stayed beside him. The gunman fired again, a sustained burst that lasted several seconds. Dozens of shots in rapid succession. Yale's Lincoln jumped the curb at 923 44th Street, crashed through a low iron fence, and smashed into the stone steps of a private residence. The engine died. Steam hissed from the punctured radiator. Blood pooled on the leather seats. Frankie Yale, 35 years old, was dead before the Nash disappeared around the corner. Within minutes, Brooklyn patrolmen arrived at the scene. They found Yale slumped over the steering wheel, his body punctured by multiple gunshot wounds, his tailored suit soaked crimson, his diamond pinky ring still catching the light. On the passenger seat, a loaded .38 revolver he'd never had time to draw. In his pockets, more than $1,800 in cash and expensive jewelry. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. Detective Stephen DeRosa examined the scene and the spent shell casings scattered in the street. The caliber and quantity suggested automatic weapons, possibly the Thompson submachine guns that had become infamous in Chicago's gang wars, but had rarely been seen in New York City homicides. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle would run the headline the next morning: Yale slain by machine gun fire. Mob king dies in hail of bullets. But the real question, the one that would haunt investigators for months, went unprinted. How did one of the most powerful mob bosses in early New York, the man who had built Brooklyn's underworld from street corner crews into a sophisticated criminal enterprise, the man who had trained Al Capone himself, end up gunned down on a quiet residential street in broad daylight? The answer may lie 800 miles west in Chicago, though the full truth of who ordered the hit and why remains debated by historians to this day. Before there was a commission, before the 5 families, before Lucky Luciano reorganized the American Mafia into a national criminal syndicate, before any of that, there was Frankie Yale. History remembers Al Capone. It remembers Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel. It remembers the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the Castellammarese War, the rise of Murder, Inc. These names and events fill the documentaries, the books, the mythology of American organized crime. Frankie Yale's name appears in footnotes. This is the story of the forgotten godfather, the man who built one of the earliest structured criminal organizations in New York. The man who showed a generation of criminals that organized crime could be organized, that violence could be managed, that protection rackets, bootlegging operations, and union control could be structured into hierarchies that generated consistent revenue. The man who took a teenage bouncer named Al Capone and transformed him into the most notorious gangster in American history, and the man whose ambition and conflicts would lead to his execution on a Brooklyn street, killed by methods he had helped pioneer. This is the story of Frankie Yale. 1893, Southern Italy. Francesco Yale was born on May 22nd in Longobucco, in the Calabrian province of Cosenza, a mountainside town where poverty wasn't a condition, it was the only condition. Southern Italy at the turn of the century was a place where the government existed only to tax, where landowners controlled everything, and where young men had two choices: submit to a lifetime of servitude or find another way. The Yale family, like thousands of others, chose the third option. They left. Around 1900 or 1901, young Francesco boarded a steamship with his parents and siblings, packed into steerage with hundreds of other Italian families fleeing hunger and hopelessness. The crossing took 2 weeks. They arrived at Ellis Island with almost nothing. Immigration officials couldn't pronounce Iole. The family settled on Yale, a name with no connection to the prestigious university, no grand ambition, just an easier word for American mouths to form. The Yales moved into a cramped tenement apartment in South Brooklyn's Italian district, where 5 families shared a single bathroom, and the summer heat made the hallways smell like rotting vegetables and desperation. Francesco's father found work as a day laborer. His mother took in laundry. The children were expected to contribute. Francesco, who now went by Frank, began working young, delivering groceries, shining shoes, running errands for local merchants. But he also began running errands for a different class of local businessmen. Brooklyn in the early 1900s was a frontier for Italian organized crime. In Manhattan, Sicilian gangs like the Morellos had already established territorial control, building protection rackets and extortion networks that preyed on Italian immigrants too afraid of authorities to report crimes. But Brooklyn was fragmented. Neapolitan crews in Red Hook, Calabrian gangs near the Navy Yard, independent operators fighting over street corners and saloons. Young Frank Yale saw the chaos and recognized opportunity. By his mid-teens, he'd graduated from errands to enforcement. He was tall, nearly 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a face that projected menace even in repose. More importantly, he had something rarer than physical strength. He had intelligence and ambition that extended beyond the next street fight. Where other teenage criminals were content to steal from fruit carts and run dice games, Yale studied the structure. He watched how the Irish gangs in downtown Brooklyn operated with coordinated violence. He observed how the Jewish gangs on the waterfront controlled theft rings with business-like efficiency. He learned that organized crime was only successful when it was actually organized. In his early 20s, Frankie Yale took over leadership of a small Calabrian street crew in South Brooklyn. His method was brutal and direct. He challenged existing leaders, fought when necessary, and established himself through a combination of violence and strategic thinking. No one questioned his authority once it was established. Yale's first major decision as crew boss revealed his strategic mind. He didn't establish headquarters in a back alley or an apartment. He opened a barber shop. Around 1912 to 1914, 318 Court Street, Brooklyn. The sign above the door read, "Yale's Barber Shop, shaves, haircuts, straight razor specialty." The front room looked legitimate enough. 4 barber chairs, mirrors with beveled edges, shelves stocked with pomades and aftershaves. Yale himself often worked the chairs, giving shaves and haircuts to neighborhood men who paid their quarter and left without incident. But the back room told a different story. Behind a door marked private sat a large oak desk, a wall safe, and a telephone line. This was where the real business happened. Loan sharking, protection collection, dispute resolution, a rotating cast of neighborhood merchants, Small-time criminals and corrupt policemen passed through that back room, each conducting transactions that never appeared in any ledger but generated consistent, reliable income. Yale's protection racket was simple: pay weekly, stay safe. Refuse to pay, and something unfortunate would happen: a fire, a robbery, a beating. The beauty of the system was its predictability. Business owners budgeted for Yale's protection fee the same way they budgeted for rent. It became just another cost of doing business in South Brooklyn. By 1915, Yale controlled multiple blocks around Court Street and the surrounding area. His crew had grown to include dozens of men, each assigned specific territories and revenue streams. He'd established relationships with local police captains, ensuring raids happened to his competitors, but not to his operations. He paid his men regularly and well, building loyalty through compensation rather than just fear. And he began to dress the part of success. Gone were the threadbare immigrant clothes of his childhood. Yale now wore three-piece suits, silk ties, and polished shoes. He slicked his thick black hair with expensive pomade and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had found his calling. Other Brooklyn gang leaders took notice. Some sought alliances. Others saw competition that needed to be eliminated. In 1915, two gunmen from a rival crew ambushed Yale outside his barbershop. They fired multiple shots. Yale survived, drew his own weapon, and fired back. One attacker was wounded. Both fled. Within days, both attackers were found dead. The message was clear. Frankie Yale didn't just survive attacks. He responded with overwhelming retaliation. In the Brooklyn underworld, a reputation for controlled brutality was more valuable than any weapon. By 1917, Yale had consolidated control over significant portions of South Brooklyn's Italian criminal operations. He'd absorbed smaller crews, eliminated stubborn rivals, and established a hierarchical structure that resembled a legitimate business more than a street gang. He had lieutenants who managed specific territories. He had collectors who handled weekly protection payments. He had enforcers who dealt with problems. The Italian-American community in Brooklyn existed in two simultaneous realities. On the surface, a struggling immigrant population working honest jobs, raising families, attending Catholic Mass on Sundays. Underneath, a shadow economy where men like Yale provided services the legitimate world didn't offer. Loans for businesses that banks refused to fund, protection from predatory criminals, dispute resolution for people who didn't trust or couldn't access the American legal system. Yale understood he was providing a service, even if that service was morally and legally dubious. The protection money he collected bought genuine protection. He discouraged violence against civilians and severely punished crew members who brought unnecessary heat from law enforcement. In his own twisted logic, he was a businessman. The fact that his business happened to be extortion, assault, and murder didn't change the fundamental economic principles at work. But Yale's ambitions extended beyond South Brooklyn street corners. He wanted legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. He wanted to be respected, not just feared. He wanted an empire built on more than muscle and menace. Between 1914 and 1917, he found his opportunity in Coney Island. Coney Island, Brooklyn. The boardwalk stretched along the Atlantic Ocean like a carnival brought to permanent life. Roller coasters, sideshows, dance halls, bathhouses, and restaurants where New Yorkers escaped the summer heat and their ordinary lives. Frankie Yale saw something else: an unregulated entertainment district where liquor flowed, gambling flourished, and thousands of customers arrived daily with cash in their pockets. He opened the Harvard Inn on Seaside Avenue, a block from the beach. The name was pure theater. Harvard suggested class and education to a working-class clientele who'd never seen the inside of a university. The reality was more complicated. The front room operated as a legitimate saloon and restaurant: white tablecloths, a mahogany bar, a piano player performing ragtime, women in evening dresses, men in their best suits. The back rooms told the real story: gambling tables, running poker, craps, and roulette. Upstairs rooms where prostitution occurred under Yale's management and protection. A basement where bootleg liquor was stored. This was still years before Prohibition, but Yale had already established smuggling connections for higher quality alcohol than legal distributors offered. The Harvard Inn became Yale's crown jewel. It generated substantial revenue. It also gave him something he'd never had before: a veneer of respectability. He was no longer just a neighborhood thug running protection schemes. He was a nightclub owner, a businessman, someone who appeared in society columns when politicians and judges attended his establishment. But the Harvard Inn's greatest contribution to American criminal history had nothing to do with money. Around 1917, a teenager named Alphonse Capone walked in looking for work. Al Capone had grown up in Navy Yard, Brooklyn, in a crowded tenement. His father was a barber. His mother did piecework from home. The family was poor, but not destitute. They had food on the table and clothes on their backs. But young Capone had been expelled from school at 14 for hitting a teacher. He'd worked odd jobs: paperboy clerk, bowling alley pin setter. Nothing stuck. He had energy, intelligence, and ambition with nowhere productive to direct it. He'd started running with street gangs, the South Brooklyn Rippers, and later the 40 Thieves Juniors. Small-time stuff: petty theft, street fights, occasional mugging. But Capone had something that separated him from the average teenage criminal. He learned fast, he followed instructions, and he understood loyalty. Johnny Torrio, a Manhattan gangster with strong Brooklyn connections, noticed the kid's potential and likely facilitated an introduction to Yale. When Capone arrived at the Harvard Inn, Yale was running one of the most successful criminal enterprises in Brooklyn. He evaluated the teenager with the practiced eye of someone who'd been assessing men for years. Capone was built solid, 5'10", muscular from working physical jobs. More importantly, he didn't fidget. He showed confidence without arrogance. Capone started that night. Bouncer, he kept his mouth shut, did what he was told, and proved himself reliable. Al Capone worked at the Harvard Inn for approximately 2 years, and in that time, Frankie Yale became the most important influence in his criminal education. Yale taught Capone that violence was a tool, not a compulsion. You didn't hit someone because you were angry. You hit them because it served a purpose: to send a message, to establish dominance, to protect territory. But unnecessary violence brought unnecessary attention from law enforcement, and attention was bad for business. He taught Capone about structure. Every criminal organization needed hierarchy: men at the bottom doing the dangerous work, men in the middle managing operations, and men at the top making strategic decisions while keeping their hands relatively clean. He taught Capone about money management. You paid your crew reliably and generously. Loyalty cost money, but it was cheaper than constant betrayal. You diversified income streams so that losing one racket didn't collapse the entire operation. Most importantly, Yale taught Capone about political protection. Every successful criminal operation required corrupt officials, cops who looked the other way, judges who dismissed charges, politicians who prevented aggressive prosecutions. This required strategy: targeted bribes, compromising information, mutually beneficial relationships. Capone absorbed every lesson. He also absorbed Yale's style: the expensive suits, the diamond jewelry, the public persona of a successful businessman rather than a street thug. In an era when most criminals looked like criminals, Yale understood that appearance was a form of armor. But Capone's education at the Harvard Inn nearly ended prematurely one night in 1917 or 1918 in an incident that would mark him for life. The Harvard Inn was crowded. Soldiers, factory workers, couples dancing. Capone was working the door, checking IDs, keeping order. A young woman entered with her brother. She was attractive. Dark hair, confident bearing, well-dressed. Capone made a crude comment as she passed. Something sexual, possibly suggesting she looked like a prostitute. The woman's brother, Frank Galluccio, heard it. "What did you say about my sister?" Capone, young and cocky, didn't back down. He repeated the comment. Galluccio pulled a knife, a 4-inch folding blade. He slashed at Capone's face 3 times in rapid succession. The first cut opened Capone's left cheek from ear to jaw. The second sliced his jaw below the ear. The third cut across his neck, narrowly missing major arteries. Capone staggered backward, blood pouring down his suit. The crowd scattered. Galluccio ran. Yale appeared moments later. He took one look at Capone's wounds and made a calculated decision. He didn't call the police. That would have invited scrutiny of the Harvard Inn's illegal operations. Instead, he arranged for a private doctor to treat Capone, someone who wouldn't report the incident. The doctor stitched Capone's face, leaving scars that would earn him a nickname he hated for the rest of his life: Scarface. But Yale's protection of Capone extended beyond medical care. He found Galluccio, who was terrified of retaliation. Instead of violence, Yale brokered a peace. Capone had been out of line. He disrespected a woman in Yale's establishment. Galluccio had defended his sister's honor. The matter was settled. No retaliation. The scars healed, but they never faded. For the rest of his life, Capone positioned himself in photographs so his left side was hidden. He told people the scars came from combat in France during World War I. He never admitted the truth. By 1919, Al Capone had evolved from a teenage bouncer into one of Yale's trusted workers. He managed operations at the Harvard Inn. He collected protection payments from surrounding businesses. He handled disputes that required muscle, but not murder. Yale relied on him increasingly, and other criminals took notice. One of those criminals was Johnny Torrio. Torrio was a different breed from Frankie Yale. Smaller, quieter, less physically imposing. But he was arguably even more intelligent, with a strategic mind that thought in terms of territory and market control, rather than street fights. Torrio had left New York for Chicago in 1909 to help his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, run brothels and gambling houses in the city's Italian district. By 1919, Torrio was effectively running the entire operation. He saw that Prohibition was coming. The 18th Amendment had been ratified in January 1919, with enforcement set to begin in January 1920. Torrio understood immediately that banning alcohol would create an unprecedented black market opportunity. Chicago, with its millions of thirsty residents and its culture of political corruption, was perfectly positioned to become a bootlegging empire. But Torrio needed people he could trust. People who were smart, capable, and loyal. People who understood how to structure criminal operations. He came to Brooklyn looking for talent. Late 1919. Johnny Torrio approached Frankie Yale about recruiting Al Capone to Chicago. The arrangement made strategic sense for Yale. Capone was talented but ambitious. Eventually, that ambition might create problems in Brooklyn. But sending Capone to Chicago served multiple purposes. It placed Yale's protege in a position to build power in America's second-largest city, and it created a natural business connection for the bootlegging opportunities Prohibition would create. Yale agreed. Capone, recognizing the opportunity, accepted. In late December 1919, Al Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago, bringing his wife May and their infant son Sonny. Yale had just made a strategic decision that would reshape American organized crime, positioning one of his trained men at the center of what would become the most powerful criminal organization in the Midwest. For years, this connection would prove extraordinarily profitable for both men, but it would also plant the seeds of Yale's eventual downfall. January 17th, 1920, 12:01 a.m. The 18th Amendment went into effect, and America's great social experiment began. Overnight, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors became illegal. Churches celebrated. Temperance activists rejoiced. Politicians congratulated themselves. And criminals like Frankie Yale built empires. Yale had been preparing for months, building infrastructure that would position him as a major alcohol supplier. While other gangsters were still figuring out basic smuggling, Yale already had relationships in place: dock access, warehouse space, transportation routes, and most importantly, political protection. His advantages were geographic and strategic. Brooklyn's waterfront gave him access to ships arriving from Canada, Europe, and the Caribbean. The borough's industrial districts provided warehouses where liquor could be stored. And Yale's growing influence over longshoremen meant he could move illegal products through the docks with reduced interference. Within months of Prohibition's start, Frankie Yale was moving substantial quantities of liquor through Brooklyn. The operation worked efficiently. Ships carrying legitimate cargo would also carry hidden alcohol. They'd dock at Brooklyn piers where Yale had influence. Longshoremen would miscount inventory, allowing cases to disappear into waiting trucks. The trucks would transport the liquor to warehouses throughout Brooklyn and beyond. From there, distributors would sell to speakeasies and wealthy customers willing to pay premium prices for quality alcohol. Yale took a percentage at multiple levels. He charged for safe docking. He charged for warehouse protection. He charged distributors for access to supply. His revenue from bootlegging grew substantially during the early 1920s, though exact figures remained speculative. By the mid-1920s, Yale was operating one of the most successful bootlegging operations in New York, generating what some estimates suggest was hundreds of thousands or potentially over $1 million annually, though precise documentation doesn't exist. But bootlegging was only one component of Yale's empire. His real genius was understanding diversification, never relying on a single revenue stream. His second major enterprise was labor racketeering. Brooklyn waterfront, early 1920s. The longshoremen's unions were the lifeblood of New York's shipping industry. These men loaded and unloaded every ship that docked, moving millions of dollars worth of cargo daily. They were also poorly paid, worked dangerous jobs, and had minimal legal protections. Yale saw opportunity in controlling their labor. He began installing his men in positions of union influence, not through elections but through intimidation and violence. Legitimate union organizers who opposed him faced threats or worse. Workers who complained had accidents on the docks. Over several years, Yale gained significant control over Brooklyn longshoremen operations. And with that control came extraordinary power. Shipping companies that refused to cooperate with Yale's interests found their cargo mysteriously delayed. Strikes would occur at inconvenient times. Shipments would be damaged or lost. Warehouse operators who didn't work with Yale's bootlegging networks discovered their legitimate businesses suffering inexplicable problems. The choice was simple: cooperate with Frankie Yale or watch your business suffer. Most chose cooperation. The longshoremen themselves didn't benefit significantly from Yale's control. Their wages barely increased. Their conditions remained dangerous, but they understood the reality. Yale's influence kept them employed, even if it enriched him far more than them. Yale also expanded his protection rackets beyond South Brooklyn. By the early 1920s, his organization controlled protection operations throughout Red Hook, Carroll Gardens, Park Slope, and parts of Bay Ridge. Italian-owned businesses, Jewish stores, Irish pubs. Establishments throughout these neighborhoods paid weekly fees to ensure nothing unfortunate happened. The payments were organized with business-like efficiency. Yale had collectors who made regular rounds. The amounts were standardized based on business size. If someone missed a payment, they received a warning. If they missed a second payment, something broke. A window, equipment, sometimes bones. Almost no one missed a third payment. By 1923, Frankie Yale controlled a criminal enterprise that touched multiple aspects of Brooklyn's economy. He owned nightclubs, restaurants, and legitimate businesses used for money laundering. He had politicians on his payroll, including some judges and city officials who provided protection from aggressive prosecution. He drove expensive cars, Lincolns, Cadillacs, luxury vehicles that announced his success. He wore silk suits and diamond jewelry. He dined at fine restaurants, always picking up the check, always tipping generously. Yale cultivated a public persona of a successful entrepreneur, a self-made man who had risen from poverty through hard work. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned him attending charity events. Politicians were sometimes photographed with him. The cognitive dissonance was deliberate. Yale understood that visible, conspicuous success made him harder to prosecute. If he looked like a legitimate businessman, juries might be less likely to convict. If he donated to churches and charities, communities might be less likely to cooperate with investigations. But beneath the tailored suits and charitable donations, Yale maintained power through systematic violence and intimidation. The mid-1920s saw increasing violence in Brooklyn's underworld. Multiple gangland killings occurred, most never solved. Investigators suspected Yale's organization was involved in many of them, either committed by his men directly or ordered to eliminate competition, enforce discipline, or remove threats. Newspapers began running more frequent stories about gang violence and unsolved murders. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle started referring to certain sections of the borough as areas where law and order seemed compromised. Public pressure mounted. Reform politicians demanded action. Citizens groups organized meetings demanding police do something about gang warfare. Yale found himself in an increasingly precarious position. The violence that had built his empire was now threatening it by attracting too much attention. Brooklyn District Attorney investigations occasionally targeted Yale, publicly accusing him of ordering killings. But proving such accusations was nearly impossible. Yale never appeared to pull triggers himself anymore. He had men for that. Witnesses refused to testify out of fear. Physical evidence disappeared. Murder investigations went cold. Between 1920 and 1927, Frankie Yale was investigated for multiple murders. He was arrested on various charges. He was never successfully convicted of capital crimes. By 1926, Yale's empire was operating at significant scale. He was moving large quantities of liquor through Brooklyn's docks. His protection rackets covered hundreds of businesses. His union influence extended to several waterfront industries. His legitimate businesses provided income and money laundering infrastructure. He'd also established connections with other criminal organizations throughout the Northeast. He worked with bootleggers in Detroit, supplying them with liquor. He had relationships with operations in Boston and Philadelphia. And most importantly, he maintained a business partnership with his former protege in Chicago. Al Capone had risen dramatically after arriving in Chicago in 1920. He'd started as Johnny Torrio's lieutenant, but by 1925, Capone controlled the entire operation. Torrio had retired after being shot and nearly killed in 1925, leaving Capone in charge. By 1926, Al Capone controlled arguably the most powerful criminal organization in America, generating tens of millions of dollars annually from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. And Frankie Yale was one of his East Coast liquor suppliers. The arrangement was mutually beneficial and profitable. Yale would ship quality liquor to Chicago. Canadian whiskey, European wines, Caribbean rum. Capone would pay premium prices and distribute through his vast network of speakeasies throughout Chicago and beyond. This relationship should have made both men wealthy and cemented Yale's position as a critical partner in one of America's most successful criminal enterprises. Instead, it may have contributed to Yale's death, though the exact circumstances and motivations remain debated by historians. 1926. The violence that built Yale's empire was becoming harder to ignore. Brooklyn newspapers ran increasingly frequent stories about gangland murders, unsolved shootings, bodies found in alleys and vacant lots. Public pressure was mounting. Reform politicians demanded action. Citizens groups organized meetings. Yale found himself under increasing scrutiny. Federal prohibition agents noticed his conspicuous wealth. Local police, even those on his payroll, faced pressure to investigate gang violence more aggressively. Investigative journalists began asking uncomfortable questions. How does a barbershop owner afford luxury cars and mansions? The murders continued. 1926 was a particularly bloody year in Brooklyn's underworld. Multiple Italian gangsters were killed in what police categorized as gang warfare. Most killings were never solved, but investigators believed many traced back to organized crime operations, including Yale's organization, either committed by his men or ordered to eliminate competition or threats. Yale's personal behavior was also becoming problematic. His success had inflated his ego. He made increasingly impulsive decisions. He'd started drinking more heavily. He was spending money ostentatiously in ways that attracted attention. He also had multiple extramarital affairs throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan, maintaining relationships with several mistresses. This wasn't unusual for successful criminals in the 1920s, but Yale was reckless about it. He wasn't discreet. He brought mistresses to public events. He showered them with expensive gifts. These personal indiscretions occasionally created conflicts and resentments, though documentation of specific incidents is limited. By early 1928, Yale faced multiple challenges. His political protection was weakening as reform movements gained traction in Brooklyn. His relationship with his organization was strained by increasing paranoia and violence. His personal life was complicated by infidelity and reckless behavior, and possibly most dangerous. Tensions may have been developing in his business relationships with other criminal organizations. Some historians speculate that conflicts arose between Yale and Chicago interests, possibly including Al Capone's organization. The theories vary. Theory 1: Yale may have been hijacking or shorting liquor shipments meant for Chicago, essentially selling the same products twice for additional profit. However, there's no definitive historical evidence documenting this. Theory 2: Yale may have been developing relationships with Capone's rivals or enemies, creating conflicts of interest that threatened Chicago's operations. Theory 3: Yale's control of New York's docks and bootlegging infrastructure made him too powerful, and Chicago interests wanted to eliminate a potential competitor or unreliable partner. Theory 4: Yale's killing may have been ordered by local New York rivals, possibly connected to Joe the Boss Masseria's organization, with no direct Chicago involvement. The truth is that historians don't definitively know who ordered Yale's assassination or the precise motive. What's documented is the killing itself and the speculation that followed. Whatever tensions existed, whether with Chicago, with local Brooklyn rivals, or with other criminal organizations, came to a violent conclusion on July 1st, 1928. The circumstances leading up to Yale's fatal drive that afternoon remain unclear. Historical records don't document a specific phone call luring him out, though he clearly left his location and began driving through Brooklyn in his Lincoln sedan. What happened next is partially documented through police investigation and witness testimony. Yale was driving through Borough Park. A black Nash sedan began following him. Through residential streets, the two cars moved in what would become a fatal chase. At 44th Street and 14th Avenue, the Nash pulled alongside Yale's Lincoln. Gunmen in the Nash opened fire. Multiple witnesses reported hearing rapid gunfire, the sound of automatic weapons discharging numerous rounds in quick succession. Yale's Lincoln swerved violently, jumped the curb, crashed through a fence, and smashed into the stone steps of a private residence. The Nash disappeared into Brooklyn traffic. Police arrived within minutes. They found Yale dead, his body struck by multiple gunshot wounds. On the passenger seat, a loaded .38 revolver he'd never drawn. In his pockets, more than $1,800 in cash and expensive jewelry. This wasn't robbery, it was execution. Detective Stephen DeRosa and Brooklyn police investigators examined the scene. The spent shell casings collected from the street were .45 caliber. The quantity and pattern suggested automatic weapons, possibly Thompson submachine guns, though reports vary on the exact weapons used. The use of such weapons was significant. Tommy guns had become infamous in Chicago gang warfare, but were rarely used in New York City homicides at that time. This led some investigators to speculate about Chicago connections, though no definitive proof emerged. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle ran the story prominently. Yale slain by machine gun fire. Mob king dies in hail of bullets. Articles detailed Yale's criminal career, his control of Brooklyn bootlegging, his suspected involvement in numerous murders. Some mentioned his connection to Al Capone, noting Yale had been Capone's mentor and former employer. The implication was clear to readers. Someone had ordered a professional hit using Chicago-style methods. But newspapers stopped short of direct accusations without proof. The investigation was extensive but ultimately inconclusive. Brooklyn police interviewed witnesses from the neighborhood. Several had seen the black Nash sedan. A few witnessed the shooting itself, though most took cover when gunfire erupted and couldn't provide detailed descriptions of the attackers. One witness reported seeing multiple men in the dark sedan wearing suits and hats. Another witnessed the Nash speeding away toward 18th Avenue. Police issued alerts for the vehicle, but it was never found. Investigators suspected the gunman abandoned the Nash quickly, switching to a pre-positioned vehicle. Detectives investigated Yale's recent activities, conflicts, and business relationships. They were aware of his bootlegging operations, his rivalry with other Brooklyn gangs, his reputation for violence. They interviewed associates, though most claimed ignorance about Yale's business, and certainly about who wanted him dead. The investigation also examined Yale's relationship with Al Capone. Detectives knew about their history and business connections. The use of automatic weapons suggested Chicago involvement. But suspicion isn't proof. No witnesses could identify specific shooters. No evidence connected particular individuals to the crime. The weapons were never recovered. And no one was talking. In Brooklyn's Italian criminal underworld, the silence was absolute. Everyone understood what had likely happened, but no one was willing to testify. Al Capone, when approached by Chicago reporters about Yale's death, expressed appropriate shock and sadness. "Frankie Yale was a good friend who gave me my start," Capone reportedly said. "I'm saddened to hear about his death." Capone had been in Chicago on July 1st with multiple witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts. Not that anyone seriously thought he'd personally participated. If Chicago was involved, it would have been through hired gunmen, not Capone himself. But whether Capone ordered the hit remains unproven. Some historians believe the Chicago connection is likely based on circumstantial evidence. The use of Tommy guns, Yale's business relationship with Capone, rumors of conflicts over bootlegging shipments. Others argue the evidence is insufficient, noting that local Brooklyn rivals had equal motive to eliminate Yale. The truth is that Frankie Yale's murder remains officially unsolved, and the full story of who ordered it and precisely why may never be definitively known. Without their leader, Yale's organization fragmented rapidly. Some men attempted to maintain control of bootlegging and protection operations. Others made deals with rival gangs. Some simply left the criminal life. Within months, much of Yale's former territory had been absorbed by other organizations. Joe, the boss, Masseria, the powerful Manhattan gang leader, gained control of significant Brooklyn bootlegging operations. Other territories were divided among various crews. The Yale barber shop on Court Street eventually closed. The Harvard Inn changed ownership. Protection rackets continued under different management. The longshoremen's unions fell under new control. Frankie Yale's criminal empire, built over 2 decades, vanished within a year of his death. Yale's funeral was held on July 5, 1928, at the Basilica of Regina Pacis in Brooklyn. It was a large, elaborate affair that captured the contradictions of his life. The church was packed with mourners, including politicians, businessmen, and numerous criminal figures. Yale's casket was expensive and ornate. The funeral procession included many cars and carriages carrying flowers. Father Joseph Palermo conducted the service, delivering a eulogy that avoided Yale's criminal activities, instead praising him as a community member. The cognitive dissonance was striking. A Catholic priest eulogizing a man who'd built his fortune on extortion, bootlegging, and violence, and who died in gang warfare. Yale's wife, Maria, dressed in black, wept throughout. His children sat beside her. Several of Yale's mistresses reportedly attended but remained unacknowledged by the family. Al Capone did not attend. He sent an elaborate floral arrangement with a card expressing condolences. The murder of Frankie Yale was never officially solved. The Brooklyn Police Department kept the case open, but no arrests were ever made. No one was charged. But in the criminal underworld, theories circulated immediately. Many believed Chicago was involved. Others suspected local rivals. The truth remained elusive, lost in the silence that always surrounded organized crime killings. The use of automatic weapons in Yale's murder did mark a turning point in gang violence. Within months, similar weapons appeared more frequently in New York gangland killings. The Tommy gun became increasingly associated with Prohibition-era organized crime. 7 months after Yale's death, on February 14, 1929, Al Capone would be widely suspected of ordering another machine gun execution, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 7 members of the rival North Side gang were lined up against a Chicago garage wall and shot to death with Thompson submachine gun guns. Whether or not Capone ordered Yale's death, the methods used in both killings became the signature of an era. The immediate aftermath of Frankie Yale's death reshaped Brooklyn's criminal landscape. The power vacuum was filled not by a single successor, but by multiple factions, each controlled by increasingly powerful bosses who saw Brooklyn as expansion territory. Joe Masseria absorbed much of Yale's bootlegging infrastructure. Salvatore Maranzano established territorial control. Vincent Mangano built operations that would eventually become the Gambino family's Brooklyn presence. Joseph Profati, who'd worked in Brooklyn's underworld during Yale's era, established his own independent operation that would become the Colombo family. The fragmentation inadvertently set the stage for the Castellammarese War of 1930 to 1931, a bloody conflict between Masseria and Maranzano factions that would ultimately lead to the establishment of the modern five families structure. But Yale's most significant legacy wasn't his territory. It was the model he pioneered. Frankie Yale was among the first Italian gangsters in New York to run organized crime with business-like structure. Before Yale's generation, Italian gangs were often chaotic, built on personal relationships and immediate violence. Yale introduced hierarchy, territories, specialized roles, consistent revenue streams, political connections. He understood that sustainable criminal enterprises required thinking beyond immediate profit. They required long-term planning, risk management, strategic partnerships, and careful management of law enforcement attention. This business model for organized crime, influenced the generation that followed. Al Capone took these lessons to Chicago and built them into a massive operation. Lucky Luciano would later reorganize New York's Italian gangs into the five-family system, creating structures that emphasize coordination and business efficiency. Meyer Lansky would build national crime networks. All of them benefited from innovations that Yale and his contemporaries pioneered in the 1910s and 1920s. So why is Frankie Yale largely forgotten? He died in 1928, before organized crime reached its peak of public awareness and power. He never appeared before Senate committees. He never was the subject of massive federal prosecutions. He never generated the extensive mythology that surrounded Capone, Luciano, or later figures. His empire also dissolved quickly after his death, leaving few lasting institutional structures. Unlike the five families, which continued for decades, Yale's organization fragmented within months. There was no Yale family for historians to track through the years. Additionally, Yale's story was overshadowed by more dramatic events. His death occurred months before the St. Valentine's Day massacre, which captured public imagination. His career was eclipsed by Al Capone's spectacular rise and fall. His organizational innovations were credited to later gangsters with higher public profiles. History, especially criminal history, often focuses on the most visible, dramatic figures. Yale operated during a transitional period, after the earlier Black Hand generation, but before the sophisticated crime families of the 1930s and beyond. He fell into a historical gap, but the evidence of his influence exists throughout organized crime history. The structured hierarchies, the diversified operations, the emphasis on political corruption and long-term strategy, these became standard practice in American organized crime, building on foundations that Yale and his contemporaries established. July 1st, 1928, 44th Street and 14th Avenue, Brooklyn. A dark Lincoln sedan crashed into stone steps, its driver dead from multiple gunshot wounds. In that moment, an era ended. One of early New York's most powerful mob bosses, a man who'd built a sophisticated criminal enterprise from street corner crews, was gone. His empire would fragment and disappear within months. His name would fade into footnotes, but his influence would echo through decades of American criminal history. Every organized crime family that followed, every gangster who understood that crime could be structured and managed, every syndicate that operated with business principles, all were building on foundations that Yale's generation had established. Before the Commission, before the modern Mafia families, before the national syndicates, there was Frankie Yale, Brooklyn's forgotten king, a man who helped shape how organized crime would operate in America. Whether his student Al Capone ordered his death remains debated. But the methods used, the automatic weapons, the professional execution, the calculated violence, reflected lessons Yale himself had taught about how power was won and maintained in their brutal world. In the end, Frankie Yale's greatest legacy may have been Al Capone. And the final lesson, whether delivered by Capone or by others, was the most brutal one of all. In the world of organized crime, no one, not even the teacher, is truly safe. But the violence didn't end with Yale's death. Brooklyn would not stay quiet. Within 2 years, the fragmented territories and power struggles would explode into the Castellammarese War, a bloody conflict between Masseria and Maranzano factions that would leave dozens dead and transform the American Mafia forever. From those ashes, Lucky Luciano would rise to help establish the Commission and the Five Families, creating modern, organized crime structures that would dominate American criminal history for decades. The story that began with Frankie Yale's innovations in Brooklyn would continue to reshape American crime for generations. Though Yale's name would largely be forgotten, lost in the shadows of the empire he helped create.